The war room stank of old leather and older blood. Maps sprawled across the oak table like the entrails of some great beast, their edges weighted down with daggers that had seen more action than most of the men who wielded them. Magnus Thorne stood at the table's head, all 6 feet and 8 inches of him, casting shadows that seemed to swallow the candlelight whole. His hands, scarred from 3 decades of warfare, traced a route through the northern territories with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of an executioner. 3,000 men, trapped beyond Iron Peak Pass, winter closing in like a fist. The numbers didn't lie, and Magnus had long ago stopped expecting them to offer comfort. 10,000 gold pieces bleeding from the treasury every month this campaign dragged on. 50,000 remaining before the kingdom's coffers ran dry. 6 weeks until the first snow made the mountain passes impassable. 6 weeks to save an army or watch it freeze to death in enemy territory. General Valen Blackwood cleared his throat, the sound like gravel shifting in a dry riverbed. 30 years of service had carved the man's face into something resembling a cliff, all hard angles and weathered patience. He pushed a report across the table with fingers that trembled slightly, though whether from age or the weight of what the parchment contained, Magnus couldn't say. Supply lines cut at 3 points. The words blurred together in Magnus's vision, not from any deficiency in his sight, but from the sheer grinding familiarity of it all. Every campaign brought the same problems dressed in different geography. Every war room discussion circled the same fundamental truth. Men needed food, steel, and hope to fight, and the enemy knew how to deprive them of all 3. Commander Garrett leaned forward, his younger face still bearing the sharp eagerness of a man who believed wars could be won through sheer aggression. His proposal hit the table like a gauntlet. Scorched earth, burn everything between here and Iron Peak, force the enemy to choose between pursuit and starvation. The silence that followed carried its own weight. Magnus studied the map, calculating. 40 villages in the proposed burn zone. Civilian population estimated at 12,000. Strategic value of denial versus moral cost of displacement. He ran the numbers with mechanical efficiency, feeling nothing as he weighed lives against tactical advantage. This was what the curse had made him, a calculating machine in human skin. Magnus couldn't remember the last time food had tasted like anything beyond fuel. Couldn't recall the texture of genuine sleep, having spent 3 decades with rest measured in hours rather than refreshment. His father's execution 40 years past should have devastated him, yet he'd watched the blade fall and felt only the cold assessment that emotional display would weaken his position with the watching nobles. 300 years since his ancestor had murdered the Lunari king and earned dying words that became binding magic. Power without peace, strength without love, a kingdom built on bones that could never rest because its rulers could never truly live. Archon Cassius spoke from the corner where he'd been standing like a piece of the furniture, ancient and overlooked until needed. His voice carried the dust of centuries spent among books that most men couldn't read and wouldn't want to. The intelligence suggests a different approach: infiltration. A strike team to reopen the northern supply route, minimal collateral damage, maximum strategic impact. Magnus's gaze shifted to the Archon, taking in the way candlelight caught in eyes that had seen things most men would call impossible. Cassius had served Magnus's father and his grandfather before him, somehow managing to accumulate years without appearing to age beyond a certain autumnal middle period. The infiltration plan made tactical sense. Magnus approved it with a gesture, already moving his mental pieces to the next problem. Food arrived on silver platters that reflected distorted versions of the men's faces. He ate because his body required it, mechanically chewing through meat that registered as texture without flavor. Blackwood broke the silence. The Princess of West Haven has sent another inquiry. Her father grows impatient for an answer regarding the marriage proposal. Magnus set down his knife with careful precision, blade aligned perfectly parallel to the plate's edge. After the northern campaign, the same answer he'd given before, the same answer that meant nothing because marriage was simply another deployment. The princess came with trade routes and a standing army of 5,000. On parchment, it made perfect sense. In the hollow place where his heart should have been, it registered no differently than acquiring horses or siege equipment. When the council finally disbanded, Magnus remained at the table, watching wax drip from guttering candles. A knock interrupted the darkness. Archon Cassius entered without waiting for permission, carrying a scroll that seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight. "The slave markets open tomorrow at dawn." Cassius placed the scroll on the table, smoothing it flat with fingers that showed no tremor despite their apparent age. "There has been an acquisition, someone you should see." Magnus raised an eyebrow. The slave markets were a quarterly necessity, a way to process prisoners of war and provide labor for the kingdom's rebuilding efforts. He'd authorized them, but never attended personally. This one is different. Cassius unrolled the scroll, revealing a sketch rendered with surprising skill. A young man, perhaps 22, with features that spoke of noble breeding despite the rags implied by the artist's quick strokes. Silver hair caught in hasty charcoal lines, but it was the eyes that made Magnus lean closer. Even in sketch form, they held something that demanded attention. Lunari bloodline. The Archon's words fell into the room like stones into still water, confirmed by 3 separate sources. This one appeared in the Northern Territory 6 months ago, made quite an impression before disappearing. Memory stirred in Magnus's tactical mind. 6 months ago, the border skirmish that should have been a slaughter but somehow turned into something else. Reports of wounded men surviving impossible injuries. Enemy forces retreating despite holding advantage. His value as an intelligence asset. Magnus spoke slowly, already calculating angles. If he was involved in northern resistance operations, he'd have information we need to wrap up the campaign before winter. Cassius nodded. "The auction begins at dawn. I took the liberty of reserving a viewing position. Subtle attendance, no official royal presence unless you choose to bid." Magnus studied the sketch, memorizing features that might prove useful. To have a Lunari available for interrogation represented an opportunity his tactical mind couldn't ignore. Day 2, the auction. Dawn arrived the way it always did in the capital, creeping over stone walls and through narrow streets with the persistence of something that had nowhere else to be. Magnus dressed in black leathers that could pass for either ceremonial or practical. A cloak that bore no royal insignia but somehow conveyed authority through cut and quality alone. The slave markets occupied a square in the city's eastern quarter. Wooden platforms stood in ascending tiers, allowing for better viewing as lots were presented. Buyers clustered in groups determined by wealth and status, their conversations creating a low buzz that reminded Magnus of flies over meat. Archon Cassius had secured a position that offered clear sightlines while maintaining anonymity among minor nobility and successful merchants. Magnus settled into the viewing area, cataloging faces and potential future assets. The auctioneer mounted the central platform with practiced ease, announcing the day's offerings with enthusiasm that made no distinction between grain and human lives. The first dozen lots passed without interest. Laborers from various campaigns, craftsmen whose skills might prove useful to workshops, domestic servants for minor houses, standard acquisitions that barely registered in Magnus's awareness. Then they brought him out. The chain seemed excessive for someone so slight, iron links thick as a man's thumb, shackling wrists and ankles with enough weight to make movement difficult. But the young man on the platform moved with an unconscious grace that the chains couldn't quite suppress. Silver hair caught morning light. The sketch hadn't done justice to the reality. This close, even at distance, there was an intensity of presence that made the crowded square feel smaller. But it was the eyes that confirmed everything. Violet. A color that shouldn't exist in human irises, but did in the old bloodlines, the ones that carried magic in their bones. The Lunari scanned the crowd with those impossible eyes, and for less than a heartbeat, his gaze locked with Magnus's. Recognition flared between them like lightning. The Lunari's expression didn't change, but Magnus felt it anyway. This man knew him, and rather than fear or hatred, those eyes held something that looked disturbingly like curiosity. The auctioneer's voice penetrated Magnus's focus. Lot 13, rare acquisition from the Northern Territories. Noble lineage, educated, multilingual. Bidding opens at 100 gold pieces. Lord Harwick bid first, his nasal voice carrying aristocratic certainty. 150. The minor noble collected beautiful things the way other men collected weapons. Magnus's hand rose before conscious decision completed itself. 500. The square went silent. Conversations died mid-word. Every eye turned toward the viewing area where Magnus sat, suddenly very much noticed. 500 gold pieces. The auctioneer's voice climbed an octave. Do I hear 600? Lord Harwick's face paled. He opened his mouth, calculated whether challenging a bid that large was worth potential consequences, then slowly shook his head and stepped back. On the platform, the Lunari's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in those eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. The auctioneer's hammer fell with finality that seemed to echo longer than physics allowed. Sold to the gentleman in the eastern viewing area for 500 gold pieces. Magnus rose, gesturing to guards he'd brought without advertising their presence. Collect him. Bring him to the eastern tower. Comfortable quarters. No chains except what's necessary for security, and no one questions him until I arrive. Blackwood appeared at his elbow, materializing from the crowd with practiced stealth. Your Majesty. The whisper carried weight despite its volume. That's a considerable sum for a household slave. Magnus watched guards move to collect his purchase, noting how the Lunari cooperated without resistance. It's a considerable investment. If he has the information we believe he does, 500 gold is cheaper than losing 3,000 men. The general nodded slowly, though his expression suggested complications beyond tactical concerns. The council will want explanations. Then the council will receive them. Magnus turned away from the platform, already moving toward the castle. Schedule a briefing for this afternoon. I want full background on this acquisition. The eastern tower had been prepared according to his instructions. A chamber on the 3rd floor, high enough to discourage escape attempts, but not isolated enough to feel like a dungeon. Furniture that spoke of comfort without luxury. A window with views of the city, reinforced with bars that could withstand even lichen strength. Magnus arrived to find the Lunari standing at the window despite ankle chains, studying the city below with intensity of someone memorizing a battlefield. Magnus dismissed the guards, waiting until the door closed before speaking. Your name. The Lunari turned slowly, those eyes assessing Magnus with audacity that bordered on challenge. Arisel Corvain. He paused, then added, No title, no family name beyond what my parents gave me before they died. The honesty was unexpected. Most prisoners began with lies, testing boundaries. Arisel offered truth with casual confidence of someone who understood that information could be both shared and withheld in the same breath. Your Lunari bloodline. Magnus moved deeper into the room, maintaining distance, but allowing his full height to register, confirmed by multiple sources, which makes you either valuable intelligence asset or extremely dangerous security risk. Possibly both. Arisel's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. I assume that's why you spent 500 gold pieces when you could have simply arrested me. Something shifted in Magnus's chest. Not the curse, though that remained present, but something else. When had someone last spoken to him with anything approaching equality? You seem remarkably calm for someone who just lost their freedom. Freedom is relative. Arisel moved away from the window, chains forcing shorter stride that somehow failed to diminish his presence. 6 months ago, I had freedom and no purpose. Now I have purpose and chains. I'm not certain which state is preferable. Magnus circled slowly, predator's instinct to assess from all angles asserting itself. 6 months ago, the border skirmish near Raven's Ridge, reports of impossible interventions. You were there. It wasn't a question, but Arisel answered anyway. I was there. Your men were walking into an ambush. 30 Lycan soldiers against 200 Lunari resistance fighters. The mathematics were unfavorable, and yet 30 Lycan soldiers survived. Magnus stopped circling, standing between Arisel and the window, because someone with healing magic intervened. Someone who should have let his people's enemies die but chose differently. Arisel met his gaze without flinching. I'm a healer before I'm a Lunari. The wounded don't stop being human just because they wear different colors. The words hung in the air, carrying weight that Magnus felt but couldn't name. He'd spent 30 years at war, fighting enemies who'd been abstract concepts more than flesh and blood. He'd never considered that those threats might include someone who'd choose to heal rather than kill. You'll answer questions about Lunari resistance operations. Magnus forced his voice back to cold efficiency. Supply routes, leadership structures, safe houses, everything you know. I'll answer questions I choose to answer. Arisel moved to sit on the chamber's single chair, somehow making surrender of standing position feel like choice rather than defeat. And before you threaten torture, understand that I've survived worse than anything your dungeons can offer. Magnus found himself studying the Lunari with renewed attention, the slight frame hiding considerable strength, the educated speech speaking of tutors and libraries, the calm acceptance of circumstances that would break lesser men. You were nobility before you were a slave. I was many things before circumstances changed. Arisel's eyes never wavered. Just as you were many things before the curse fully claimed you. The words hit like physical blow. Magnus felt his jaw tighten, claws extending slightly before he forced them to retract. You know nothing about me. I know the curse. Arisel leaned forward slightly, chains clinking. I know what your ancestor did to earn it. I know what it's taken from you. Every Thorne king for 300 years, powerful beyond measure but hollow at the core. Magnus moved faster than human eyes could track, crossing distance in a heartbeat. His hand gripped the chair's armrest, claws scoring wood, bringing his face level with Arisel's. You presume too much, but Arisel didn't flinch. Do I? When did you last sleep peacefully? When did food last have flavor? When did you last feel anything beyond tactical satisfaction of a well-executed plan? The accuracy struck deeper than any blade. Magnus held position, close enough to see flecks of silver in those eyes, close enough to feel warmth radiating from Arisel's skin. For just a moment, something in his chest shifted, not breaking, not melting, but adjusting, creating space for something he couldn't name. He released the chair and stepped back. You'll remain here, guards at the door. Comfortable confinement while we determine your value. As a slave or as a person? The question carried no accusation, just genuine curiosity. Magnus didn't answer. The distinction had never mattered before. But standing in this room, meeting those eyes, he felt certainty shifting like sand beneath his feet. Day 2, the council. The council meeting that afternoon carried all the warmth of a winter storm. Magnus took his position at the table's head, facing men who'd served him faithfully and now looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. General Blackwood opened with characteristic directness, his military bearing evident in posture and tone. 500 gold pieces, Your Majesty. The Treasury can afford it, but the symbolism concerns us. The last time a Thorne king paid such a sum for a single slave was your grandfather, and that ended poorly. Magnus kept his voice level, reciting facts with precision of military report. Arisel Corvain, confirmed Lunari bloodline, present at multiple resistance operations over the past 6 months. His intelligence value exceeds his purchase price by orders of magnitude. Commander Garrett leaned forward, skepticism clear in his squared shoulders and narrowed gaze. His voice carried the blunt confidence of younger command. Intelligence value implies he'll cooperate. Most resistance fighters would rather die than betray their cause. What makes you think this one is different? Because he saved 30 of our men when letting them die would have served his cause better. Magnus met each man's gaze in turn. Because he understands that wars have costs beyond the battlefield. Lord Castellan spoke next, his administrative precision evident in clipped syllables and careful word choice. The ledgers show concerning patterns, Your Majesty. War expenditure continues to drain the treasury. Perhaps this asset could provide intelligence to expedite northern campaign resolution and restore fiscal stability. Archon Cassius spoke from his corner, voice carrying weight of centuries. The Lunari have specific magical capabilities, healing primarily, but also what some call emotional influence. If Arisel Corvain is what he appears to be, his value extends beyond mere intelligence. Lord Harwick, the conservative noble whose bid Magnus had overwhelmed, cleared his throat with aristocratic delicacy. His words emerged with the practiced neutrality of a politician. Your Majesty, the court will inevitably speculate about your interests. Some may suggest magical coercion rather than strategic investment. Then they'll be wrong. Magnus rose, his full height lending weight to words that needed no emphasis. I make decisions based on tactical necessity, not supernatural influence. Arisel Corvain will be interrogated. If he proves valuable, his status will be adjusted. If he proves dangerous, I'll handle it. But do not mistake strategic flexibility for weakness. He left before anyone could respond. aware that he'd just crossed some invisible line. But for the first time in longer than Magnus could remember, he found he didn't care about political implications. Days 3 and 4, the partnership. The Eastern Tower felt different when Magnus returned that evening. Same stones, same torches, same guards at attention. But something had shifted in the hours since his last visit. Arisel sat at the small table, papers spread before him in careful array. Maps, Magnus realized as he entered. The Lunari had been drawing maps from memory, charting territories with precision of someone who'd traveled them extensively. "You didn't strike me as someone who'd cooperate so readily." Magnus closed the door, waving off guards. The maps showed details that would take weeks to extract through conventional interrogation. "I'm not cooperating, I'm demonstrating value." Arisel looked up. "There's a difference." Magnus moved to the table, studying maps with tactician's eye. "This route here." He pointed to a path threading through mountains marked as impassable. "This is how your people move supplies to the northern resistance. It's also the route your men should take to reach the trapped soldiers at Iron Peak Pass." Arisel's finger traced the line with certainty. 3 days faster than the main roads. No Lunari forces positioned to intercept. Your men could be reinforced before the first snow. "Why help us?" Magnus heard the question emerge. "Why provide intelligence that weakens your own people's position?" Arisel set down his quill, meeting Magnus's gaze. "Because I've spent 6 months watching good people die for a war that serves no one's interests. Lunari resistance wants freedom. Your kingdom wants stability. Those goals aren't mutually exclusive." Magnus felt something adjust in his chest, that persistent sense of movement where before there had been only stillness. "You think understanding the curse is the first step toward ending the conflict. I think your ancestor killed mine in combat that was supposed to determine succession peacefully." Arisel stood, moving to the window where evening light painted everything in amber. "The dying Lunari king's last words bound your bloodline to power without peace, strength without love. 300 years of Thorne kings who conquered everything except their own emptiness." The history was familiar, but hearing it from Lunari perspective added dimensions Magnus had never considered. "Your people could have fought harder. We tried, for 50 years after the conquest. My grandmother was part of the last organized resistance. She survived to old age and spent it teaching me that revenge is just another form of chain." Magnus found himself drawn to the window, standing closer than tactical wisdom suggested. The city spread below them, lights beginning to emerge as day surrendered to evening. How many down there knew the full weight of history that shaped their lives? "Archon Cassius believes the curse can be broken." Magnus spoke quietly, the admission feeling dangerous. He's studied it for decades. He thinks there's a mechanism, a condition that could end it. "There is." Arisel turned from the window, and suddenly they were face to face. "But the price is high. Higher than conquest. Higher than gold." "What price?" "The curse was created with Lunari magic. Blood magic, powered by a dying king's rage and grief." Arisel's fingers traced symbols on the stone sill. To break it requires the same components. Lunari magic, blood, and something your ancestor stole when he struck the killing blow. "What did he steal?" "The possibility of love between bloodlines." Arisel spoke with certainty of historical fact. "Your ancestor and mine were friends once, brothers in all but blood. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. The curse reflected that. No Thorne will know love until a Thorne chooses love with a Lunari freely given and freely received." Magnus stepped back, implications hitting like siege weapons. "You're saying the only way to break the curse is for someone of my bloodline to fall in love with someone of yours. I'm saying the curse can only be broken through the same connection it was meant to destroy." Arisel's voice remained steady. "Whether that's love or trust or simple human connection, I don't know. But cooperation is the key." The words settled into Magnus's chest, finding space in the adjustments the curse had left. For 30 years he'd fought wars designed to maintain dominance. The idea that victory might require vulnerability contradicted everything he'd been taught. But standing here with a Lunari who'd saved his men and drawn maps and spoken truths that cut deeper than any blade, Magnus felt something shifting. Over the next 2 days, Magnus found himself in the Eastern Tower more often than tactical necessity demanded, morning briefings that could have been handled by subordinates. Afternoon strategy sessions that extended past sunset, evening conversations that had nothing to do with war. They stood over maps, Arisel explaining terrain features, while Magnus calculated logistics. They debated philosophy, the Lunari's perspective on honor and duty, offering counterpoint to Magnus's tactical worldview. They shared meals, and Magnus noticed that food was beginning to register as something beyond fuel. On the fourth evening since the auction, Magnus found himself describing his father's execution to someone for the first time in 40 years. The words emerged haltingly, carrying weight he hadn't known they possessed. They called him weak. Magnus stared at nothing, remembering. Magnus the merciful. He pardoned enemies who later betrayed him, showed compassion to those who used it against him, and when they finally executed him for treason, I watched and felt nothing. The curse made sure of that. Arisel listened without interruption, his presence somehow making the confession bearable. I spent 40 years believing he was weak. That mercy killed him, Magnus continued. But standing here, talking to you, I'm beginning to wonder if the curse made me unable to see what he understood. That strength and compassion aren't opposites. Your father saw clearly despite the curse. Arisel spoke quietly. That's why they killed him. Not because mercy was weakness, but because they feared what mercy represented, the possibility of change. The silence that followed felt charged with possibilities neither seemed ready to name. Finally, Magnus spoke. Tomorrow, I present your intelligence to the War Council. We'll begin planning the relief operation for Iron Peak Pass. Your contribution will be noted. And my status? Magnus met those eyes, feeling weight of honest answer. You're not a slave. You haven't been since you started helping us. Tomorrow I formalize that with the council. You'll be designated as consultant, strategic advisor, someone whose value extends beyond simple labor. Arisel's expression shifted, something that might have been gratitude mixing with wariness. And when the Northern campaign ends, when I've provided all the intelligence I possess, Magnus found himself stepping closer, drawn by something he couldn't articulate. Then we'll find other ways for you to contribute, because somewhere between interrogation and strategy sessions, you stopped being an asset to be exploited and started being something else. What? Magnus paused at the doorway, looking back at the Lunari silhouetted against the evening window. Someone I'm beginning to trust. And for a cursed king who spent 30 years trusting no one, that's more valuable than any intelligence. He left before Arisel could respond, before the moment could become something more than Magnus was prepared to handle. But walking through castle corridors back to his own chambers, he felt something adjusting in his chest. Not weakening, but shifting, making room for something that might have been hope if hope had been available to someone as thoroughly claimed as Magnus Thorne. The night that followed brought dreams for the first time in a decade. Fragmented images of violet eyes and careful maps, of conversations that went deeper than tactics, of a hand reaching across centuries of violence to offer something Magnus had forgotten how to recognize: connection, understanding, the possibility that strength and vulnerability might not be opposites after all. He woke before dawn on the 5th day since the auction, aware that something fundamental had changed. Not in the castle, not in the kingdom, but in the hollow space where his heart should have been, something was beginning to stir. The war wasn't over. The northern territories still needed resolution. But for the first time since his father's execution, Magnus felt the stirring of something beyond tactical satisfaction. He felt curiosity, interest, the beginning of investment in an outcome that extended beyond strategic necessity. He felt almost human again. And in the eastern tower, Arisel Corvain stood at his window, watching dawn paint the capital in shades of gold, wondering if the Wolf King understood yet what had been set in motion. Wondering if either of them was prepared for the path that lay ahead. The curse was ancient, the bloodlines were enemies, the history was written in blood. But morning had arrived anyway, carrying with it the possibility that even the oldest wounds might heal if given enough time and courage. In the distance, church bells rang to mark the dawn of Day 5, and in 2 separate spaces within the same castle, 2 men from enemy bloodlines stood watching the same sunrise, thinking thoughts that ran parallel without quite intersecting yet. But they would. History demanded it. And somewhere deeper than either could articulate, beyond the reach of ancient magic and ancestral violence, something had recognized something, a connection that transcended strategy and interrogation and careful distance both men maintained, something that might, given time and courage and willingness to risk everything, become the very thing the curse had spent 3 centuries trying to prevent. Understanding, trust, and possibly, though neither would admit it yet, the first stirrings of something that future generations might call love. Day 6, the decision. Morning light streaming through the eastern tower window found Magnus and Arisel bent over maps again, though the dynamic between them had shifted in ways both recognized but neither named. 5 days since the auction, 4 days since Arisel had begun demonstrating his value through intelligence that would have taken months to extract through conventional means. Your men are here. Arisel's finger traced positions on the northern map with confidence born from personal knowledge. The 3,000 trapped at Iron Peak. They've been rationing supplies, but winter approaches faster in the mountains, 2 weeks at most before conditions become critical. Magnus studied the terrain with commander's eye, calculating distances and obstacles. The main pass is too well defended. Every scouting report confirms Lunari resistance has fortified positions at 3 choke points. Then don't assault directly. Arisel's hand moved to a different section. This trail. Most maps don't show it because the entrance is hidden behind a waterfall. But it cuts through the mountains, emerging here, behind their defensive lines. Magnus leaned closer, shoulders nearly touching as he examined the route. How do you know this trail exists? Because I used it 6 months ago, when I was trying to reach your men before the ambush killed them all. Arisel glanced up, their faces suddenly very close. The same ambush that should have ended with 30 lichen corpses, instead of 30 survivors. A knock interrupted the moment. General Blackwood entered at Magnus's summons, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man carrying unwelcome news. Your Majesty, we have a problem. Magnus straightened, command mantle settling into place with practiced ease. Report. Commander Garrett's son. Blackwood's voice carried unusual heaviness, the gruff soldier struggling with emotional weight. He was part of the scouting party we sent to verify the northern route. They were ambushed 3 days ago. Most returned, but young Thomas Garrett was captured by Lunari resistance forces. Magnus felt his jaw tighten. Casualties among the rest? None. Blackwood shifted, uncomfortable with what came next. That's the unusual part. The ambush was positioned to capture, not kill. They specifically targeted Garrett's son. Intelligence suggests they knew exactly who he was. Magnus looked to Arisel, who had gone very still. You know something about this. It wasn't a question, and Arisel didn't treat it as one. The resistance has limited resources. They can't match your military strength directly, so they use leverage. Capture someone valuable, create a situation where the cost of rescue exceeds strategic value of continued aggression. Blackwood's hand moved to his sword hilt, unconscious gesture speaking of barely controlled anger. The gravel in his voice turned to steel. You're saying they took a boy to use as a bargaining chip. I'm saying they took a commander's son to force a choice. Arisel's voice remained steady, but something in his posture suggested he found no pleasure in the tactic. It's not honorable, but honor is a luxury most resistance movements can't afford. Magnus moved to the window, staring out while his mind worked through implications. What will they demand in exchange for his release? Arisel joined him, maintaining careful distance but speaking quietly. They'll want you. Not to kill, not directly. They'll ask for a meeting, peace negotiations at neutral ground, a chance to determine if the rumors about you are true. What rumors? That you're changing, that the curse is weakening. Arisel's eyes held depths Magnus was only beginning to understand. They want to know if peace is possible, if this war can end in any way except mutual destruction. The implications settled over the room like snowfall. Magnus could feel Blackwood's tension, the general's tactical mind calculating risks of exposing their king to potential assassination. Arrange it. Magnus spoke with finality of command. I'll meet with the Lunari resistance. Neutral ground, appropriate security. Blackwood, you'll command the escort, 200 men, enough to discourage treachery but not invasion. Your Majesty, this is madness. Blackwood's protest carried weight of decades of service, the loyal general finally balking at orders. You'll be exposed, vulnerable. Even with 200 men, an assassination attempt could succeed. Then we ensure they have no reason to want me dead. Magnus returned to the map. Arisel, you'll accompany us. Your presence signals genuine negotiation, not theater. Arisel's expression remained neutral, but Magnus caught the slight widening of his eyes. "You're trusting me not to betray you the moment we're in Lunari territory. I'm trusting you to want what I'm beginning to want." Magnus met his gaze squarely. "An end to the cycle. You saved my men once. I'm gambling you'll choose peace over vengeance a second time." Silence carried weight that transcended words. Finally, Arisel nodded. "I'll help arrange the meeting. Elder Muriel leads the resistance. She's pragmatic. If anyone can negotiate in good faith, it's her." Blackwood looked between them with expression mixing concern and resignation. "The council will never approve this." "Then we don't tell them until after we've left." Magnus smiled coldly. "Sometimes command means acting before bureaucracy can prevent necessary action. Prepare the escort, General. We depart at dawn tomorrow." Days 7 through 10. The journey north. The strike team departed 3 hours before dawn on day 7, 500 cavalry and support personnel moving with practiced silence through the sleeping capital. Magnus had decided to combine the diplomatic mission with a show of military capability, the escort large enough to discourage attack, but mobile enough to respond to threats. Magnus rode at their head, Blackwood beside him, and Arisel close enough that Magnus maintained constant awareness of his presence. The Lunari sat his horse with easy competence that spoke of extensive riding experience, another detail that reinforced his noble background. The ride north took them through increasingly rugged terrain. Day 7 passed in steady travel, the column making good time on roads that had seen recent maintenance. They camped that evening in a valley that offered good sight lines, Blackwood positioning sentries with paranoid efficiency that had kept him alive through 3 decades of campaigns. Magnus found himself seeking out Arisel after the command tent had been established. The Lunari stood at the camp's edge, staring north toward mountains that held both destination and danger. Having second thoughts? Magnus joined him, maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their interactions. "About helping you negotiate with my people?" Arisel's slight smile held no humor. "Constantly. But second thoughts don't change first decisions." "You're afraid." Magnus spoke the observation without judgment, not of assassination. "You're afraid of what it means if this actually works." Arisel glanced at him, something shifting in those eyes. "If it works, if we actually negotiate peace, then 300 years of bloodshed will have been for nothing. All those deaths, all that suffering, will be revealed as waste that could have been prevented generations ago. Or it means that sometimes change requires the right circumstances and the right people." Magnus found himself stepping closer. "Your grandmother taught you that revenge is a chain. Perhaps peace requires someone willing to risk being the first to lay down arms." The conversation continued as stars emerged, 2 men discussing philosophy and strategy and the weight of choices that would define futures. When Magnus finally returned to his tent, he carried the warmth of connection that had nothing to do with tactical alliance. Day 8 brought them to rougher country, the road narrowing as it climbed into foothills. Blackwood maintained heightened alert, scouts ranging far ahead to detect potential ambush. The general approached Magnus during the midday halt, his expression grave. "The men are nervous." Blackwood spoke quietly, the experienced commander reading his troops' mood. "They know we're riding toward enemy territory with their king exposed. Some are questioning the wisdom of this mission. Then remind them that I've commanded armies for 30 years and haven't gotten myself killed yet." Magnus kept his voice level, the tone of a leader who expected to be obeyed. This negotiation could save 3,000 of their brothers at Iron Peak. That's worth the risk. The general nodded but didn't look convinced. "If this goes badly, if you're killed, the kingdom will tear itself apart over succession. Have you considered what that means?" Magnus had considered it extensively. "Have contingency plans been prepared?" "Lord Castellan has draft documents naming a regent council until succession can be formalized." Blackwood's administrative precision showed through military bearing. "But documents mean nothing if the noble houses decide to settle the question with steel. Then we succeed." Magnus spoke with certainty he didn't entirely feel, "because failure isn't an option I'm willing to consider." Day 9 brought them into mountain country proper, the road becoming little more than a trail carved from stone. They made camp early, the column needing rest before the final push to Old Sanctum. Magnus walked the perimeter with Blackwood, inspecting defensive positions with the attention to detail that had become habit. Arisel found him as evening settled, carrying tension Magnus could read even at distance. "I need to tell you something about tomorrow's meeting." Magnus nodded, following Arisel away from the fires to a position offering privacy while remaining within guard sight. Elder Miriel will negotiate in good faith. I believe that absolutely. Arisel's voice carried tension Magnus hadn't heard before. But the resistance isn't monolithic. There are factions within it, groups that see peace as betrayal. There may be elements present tomorrow who want you dead, not as political statement, but as emotional necessity. You're saying assassination is likely. I'm saying it's possible. Arisel stepped closer, intensity radiating from him. I'm also saying I'll do everything in my power to prevent it. Not because you're my king, but because I've come to believe you might actually be capable of ending this war. And that possibility is worth protecting. Magnus studied his face in moonlight, searching for deception and finding only earnest concern. Why tell me this now? Why not earlier when I could have called off the meeting? Because if I'd told you earlier, you would have called it off. Arisel's slight smile held no humor. You would have made the safe choice, but safe choices keep the cycle going. Someone has to take the risk of genuine vulnerability. The words settled into Magnus's chest, finding spaces that were adjusting to accommodate new possibilities. You're gambling with my life to force a situation where peace might be possible. I'm gambling with both our lives. Arisel's hand rose, hovering near Magnus's chest but not quite making contact. If they kill you, they'll kill me immediately after. Lunari who cooperate with Thorne kings don't survive. But I've decided that some gambles are worth making. Magnus caught his wrist before the hand could withdraw, holding it in place. Through leather and cloth, he wondered if Arisel could feel how his pulse had quickened. If we survive tomorrow, there are questions I need to ask you. Ask them now. Tomorrow might not give us the chance. Magnus released his wrist but didn't step back. Why did you really save my men 6 months ago? What calculation made 30 enemy soldiers worth exposing yourself? Arisel's eyes reflected moonlight and something deeper. Because I was tired of watching good people die for bad reasons. Because at some point, hatred becomes its own prison. Because I looked at those 30 men and saw the same fear and hope I'd seen in Lunari faces. And I couldn't maintain the fiction that we were different species. He paused, then continued with words that felt like confession. And because some part of me wondered if this might be the beginning. The first step toward whatever path could break curses and end cycles and make 300 years of bloodshed mean something. You knew, even then. Magnus heard himself speak understanding. You suspected who I was and what I represented. I suspected. Arisel's hand returned to Magnus's chest, palm flat against leather. I didn't know for certain until the auction. Until I saw you bid 500 gold with an expression that suggested you had no idea why. That's when I understood the curse was already cracking. They stood in moonlight, close enough that breath misted together, while around them soldiers maintained watch and prepared for whatever tomorrow would bring. Finally, Magnus spoke. If we survive, I want to continue this conversation, properly, without guards and tactical concerns and the weight of history watching every word. I'd like that. Arisel's smile carried warmth Magnus felt in his chest. They returned to camp separately, maintaining careful distance both recognized as necessary. But something had been acknowledged between them, some unspoken understanding that the path forward led through territory neither had mapped. Day 10, the negotiation. The ruins of Old Sanctum rose against morning sky on day 10, ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of history and remained standing through it all. The site had been chosen for its neutrality, sacred ground to both bloodlines. Blackwood positioned troops with attention to tactical advantage while maintaining appearance of cooperation. Magnus could see similar calculations on the Lunari side as their escort emerged from the northern approach. Roughly equal numbers, roughly equal positioning, both sides prepared for violence while hoping for peace. Elder Miriel stood at the center of the ruins, flanked by resistance fighters who carried themselves with discipline of experienced soldiers. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her presence carried authority earned through survival and service. Magnus approached with Arisel at his side, and Blackwood a careful step behind. The physical positioning spoke volumes about trust and vulnerability. King Magnus. Miriel's voice carried clarity of someone accustomed to command. Thank you for accepting our invitation. These circumstances are unprecedented, as is my willingness to consider them. Magnus stopped at neutral center, close enough for conversation, but far enough that sudden violence would give both sides time to react. I'm told you hold Commander Garrett's son. We hold young Thomas as guarantee of good faith." Muriel gestured, and guards brought forward a young man bearing clear resemblance to his father. He was unharmed but frightened. "He'll be released unharmed if you hear what we have to say and consider it fairly." Magnus studied the boy, noting signs of decent treatment. "Consider what?" "Peace." Muriel spoke the word with weight from years of warfare. Real peace, not temporary cessation. Autonomy for Lunari and Northern Territories. Freedom to practice our traditions without persecution. Trade agreements that benefit both kingdoms. Magnus listened carefully, evaluating terms that would have been unthinkable under his father's rule. "Your terms are reasonable, but implementation will face resistance from my council. They'll see compromise as weakness. Then perhaps it's time your council learned the difference between strength and stubbornness." Muriel's slight smile held no mockery. 300 years of warfare have gained your kingdom what exactly? Territory you can't hold without constant military presence? Resources extracted at costs exceeding their value? She paused, words aimed at Magnus personally. "Or perhaps what you've gained is exactly what the curse intended. Power without peace. Strength without satisfaction." Magnus felt the words strike with uncomfortable accuracy. He became aware of Arisel beside him, Blackwood behind, young Thomas whose life hung on decisions made in this moment. And then he saw movement in peripheral vision. A servant, one of those circulating among the Lunari delegation with water, moving with purpose that didn't match the pattern. Magnus's combat instincts activated before conscious thought, tracking the figure's approach and recognizing wrongness in timing and trajectory. The servant's hand emerged from robes, gripping a blade that gleamed with liquid that couldn't be water. "Poison," Magnus's tactical mind supplied. Time slowed. Magnus's hand moved toward his weapon. Blackwood was too far. The Lunari guards watched wrong direction. Muriel's expression shifted from negotiation to horror. And then Arisel moved. The Lunari crossed space between Magnus and Assassin with impossible speed, tackling the king sideways. They hit ground together, rolling, as poisoned blade passed through space Magnus had occupied heartbeats before. Chaos erupted. Blackwood's troops reacted, weapons drawn, forming defensive perimeter. Lunari resistance fighters responded to sudden violence. For a moment, stretching toward eternity, the ruins teetered on edge of massacre. "Stand down!" Magnus's voice cut through chaos with authority of decades. "All of you, stand down immediately!" Muriel's voice joined his, commanding her forces to hold position. The assassin found himself surrounded by both sides. His plan collapsed the moment Arisel intervened. Magnus rose slowly, acutely aware of Arisel's weight against him, the Lunari having positioned himself as shield. "Get up!" He helped Arisel to his feet, hands lingering on the Lunari's shoulders. The assassin stood alone in a circle of hostile attention, poisoned blade fallen from nerveless fingers. His face bore marks of someone who'd lost everything. "You're weak!" The words emerged as accusation and prayer. "Muriel is weak. Magnus Thorne must die or we'll never be free." Muriel's expression went cold. "Who sent you? What faction dares undermine negotiations?" The assassin laughed, sound edged with hysteria. "No faction sent me. Just a father whose daughter died in a Thorne raid 5 years ago. Just a man who knows monsters don't become saints because they start having feelings." Magnus studied the assassin with new understanding. This wasn't political calculation. This was grief transformed into violence. "Your daughter, what was her name?" The assassin's expression flickered with surprise. "What?" "Your daughter who died. What was her name?" Magnus took a step forward. "If I'm the reason she's dead, I should at least know her name." Silence fell. The assassin stared as if seeing something impossible. "Elena. Her name was Elena. She was 12. She died when your forces burned Thornhaven Village to prevent it being used as resistance stronghold." Magnus felt each word land like physical blow. He remembered the tactical reports. 12 casualties, unusually low for that operation. Acceptable collateral damage. He'd never thought about their names. "I'm sorry." The words emerged before Magnus fully processed speaking them. "Your daughter's death was unnecessary. My orders created circumstances that killed her. I am genuinely sorry." The assassin's face crumpled, grief breaking through rage. "You're sorry? My Elena is dead and you're sorry?" "Yes." Magnus held his ground. "I can't bring her back. I can't undo the orders. All I can offer is acknowledgement that her life mattered and her death was wrong. That the strategic necessity I used to justify the action doesn't erase the human cost. Muriel stepped forward, guards moving to take the assassin into custody. This man will face justice for undermining negotiations. Magnus raised a hand. Wait! He approached the assassin, close enough to be struck if the man had another weapon. I can't give you your daughter back, but I can promise that if peace is achieved today, no other father will lose a daughter the way you lost Elena. That has to be worth something. The assassin stared, tears cutting tracks through dirt. You're really changing. I don't know. Magnus admitted the uncertainty. But I'm trying to. And if trying means acknowledging harm I've caused and choosing differently, then yes, I'm changing. Muriel's guards took the assassin away gently despite circumstances. The elder turned to Magnus with expression mixing respect and cautious hope. That was unprecedented. No Thorne king in history has apologized to a Lunari. Then perhaps history can start moving differently. Magnus looked to Arisel. Your terms are acceptable. I'll take the proposal to my council. And if the council refuses, Muriel asked, then I'll remind them that kings rule councils, not the other way around. Magnus allowed himself a slight smile. Besides, I have advisors now who can help navigate political complexities. The meeting concluded with formal agreements to release Thomas Garrett and establish communication channels. As Magnus's escort prepared to return south, Muriel approached one final time. Archon Cassius sends word. She spoke quietly. He says the curse breaks through willing sacrifice, but the breaking comes with costs. Emotional flooding. Loss of controls that have kept you stable. You'll need an anchor, or the reawakening will destroy you. Magnus glanced at Arisel. What kind of anchor? Someone bonded to your life force. Someone who can share the emotional burden. Muriel's gaze shifted to Arisel. Someone Lunari, preferably, since the curse originated from our magic. That sounds like slavery with extra steps. Arisel's voice carried steel. Not against their will. Muriel met his eyes. The ritual only works if both parties choose it freely. We'll discuss this after we've returned safely. Magnus spoke with finality. Days 11 through 14, the return. The return journey passed in contemplative silence. Day 11 took them back through mountain passes, the column moving with heightened awareness after the assassination attempt. Day 12 brought them to lower elevations, terrain becoming more forgiving as they descended. On the evening of Day 13, camped in the same valley they'd used on the journey north, Magnus found Arisel at the perimeter. You're thinking about the bonding ritual. I'm thinking about costs and choices. Arisel's voice carried unspoken concerns. Binding life forces means if you die, I die. If you go mad, I experience the same madness. He paused. And I'm thinking about why that doesn't terrify me as much as it should. What does that mean? It means I've already chosen. Arisel turned to face him. I chose when I saved your men. I chose when I let myself be captured. I chose when I drew those maps. Every moment since the auction has been me choosing you over safety. His hand rose to Magnus's chest. I can feel it. The curse cracking. Every genuine emotion you experience weakens it. Fear when the assassin struck, relief when I survived. You're breaking free, Magnus. And when you do, the emotional flooding will be catastrophic. So you'll bond with me. Magnus covered Arisel's hand with his own. You'll risk everything to stabilize my transition. I'll risk everything because the alternative is watching you destroy yourself. Arisel's voice carried conviction. Because somewhere between interrogation and midnight conversations, you stopped being the enemy and started being someone I care about more than my own safety. Magnus felt something fundamental shift. When we return to the capital, we'll speak with Archon Cassius, learn what the ritual requires, and if you still choose it after understanding full costs, then I'll accept your sacrifice and try to be worthy of it. You're already worthy. Arisel's smile carried warmth. You just need to believe it. Day 14 brought them within sight of the capital, stone walls appearing on horizon like promise of safety and complication both. Magnus rode through gates with Arisel beside him, aware of eyes tracking their return and tongues already preparing to wag. The council convened within hours. Magnus presented Muriel's terms with clinical precision, laying out costs and benefits with tactical clarity. Blackwood spoke first, his gruff support carrying weight. The terms are reasonable. We've spent 10,000 gold monthly on Northern Campaign. Peace would redirect those resources to development. Economically, acceptance makes sense. But politically, Lord Harwick interjected, his aristocratic tones carrying practiced concern. We show weakness. Every neighboring kingdom will see compromise as invitation to press demands. Or they'll see pragmatism. Archon Cassius spoke from his corner. They'll see a king capable of choosing strategic flexibility over rigid doctrine. Lord Castellan added his precise administrative voice. The ledgers support General Blackwood's assessment. Fiscal stability requires resolution of northern expenditures. The debate continued for hours. Finally, Magnus exercised the authority that had always been his. The terms are accepted. Implementation begins immediately. Anyone with concerns can direct them to me personally. As the council dispersed, Cassius approached. Your Majesty, a word about the curse. They retreated to Magnus's study with Arisel. The ancient scholar produced texts, pages covered in script predating current language. The curse is accelerating its collapse. Cassius spoke with certainty. Without proper anchoring, emotional reawakening will destroy you. I've seen it happen before. How many have tried? 3 in the last 100 years. All died. 2 went mad first. The 3rd simply stopped functioning. And the bonding ritual prevents this? It shares the burden. Cassius showed them the text. The ritual binds 2 life forces, creating shared emotional capacity. What are the costs? Arisel studied the text carefully. It means your life becomes extension of Magnus's. Cassius met his gaze. You age at his rate. You feel echoes of his emotions. And if he dies, you die. Once forged, it's permanent until death claims both. When can we perform the ritual? Days. Perhaps a week if Magnus maintains rigid control. Cassius closed the text. But the longer we wait, the more dangerous the breaking becomes. The ritual should happen soon. Tonight, if possible. Magnus turned to Arisel. You don't have to do this. There are no alternatives. Arisel's hand found Magnus's. I've already chosen. Let's not waste time second-guessing. Day 15, the bonding. The ritual chamber had been prepared according to Cassius's specifications. Ancient stones carved with symbols predating written history. Candles positioned in meaningful patterns. At the center, a circle large enough for 2 people. Cassius reviewed requirements. The bonding requires verbal consent, freely given 3 times by each participant. Physical contact throughout, and absolute honesty. Any doubt will cause the magic to fail. Once begun, it cannot be stopped. Once completed, it cannot be undone. Are you both certain? Magnus looked at Arisel, seeing moonlight captured in those eyes, seeing the person who'd saved his men, drawn maps, spoken truths that cut deeper than blades. I'm certain. As am I. Arisel's voice carried matching certainty. They entered the circle, facing each other with hands clasped. Cassius began incantation in ancient language, words resonating with power. Speak the words, 3 times each, alternating. Magnus spoke first. I bind my fate to Arisel Corvain. Arisel responded, I bind my fate to Magnus Thorne. I share his burden willingly. I share his burden willingly. I choose this bond of my own will. I choose this bond of my own will. They repeated the sequence 3 times total, words building until the chamber filled with power that had everything to do with 2 people choosing each other across centuries of bloodshed. On the final repetition, light exploded from their joined hands, silver fire that didn't burn but illuminated, racing up their arms until both men blazed with radiance. Magnus gasped as sensation flooded through him. Connection, awareness of another consciousness touching his own. Arisel's presence in his mind, not thoughts but emotions. Determination mixed with fear, mixed with something remarkably like love. And through it all, the curse cracked. Not breaking yet, but fracturing with sounds like ice calving. 30 years of suppressed emotion pressing against weakening bonds. But now, with Arisel bound to him, Magnus felt less fear. The emotional deluge would flow into both of them. Shared burden. The light faded, leaving them standing in a circle marked by glowing symbols. Magnus looked at his left wrist, seeing silver mark that hadn't been there before, a pattern matching the one on Arisel's wrist. It's done. Cassius spoke with satisfaction and concern. You're bound now. Magnus felt Arisel's emotions bleeding across the bond. Relief, exhaustion, cautious joy, and beneath it all, determination to see this through. How long until the curse breaks completely? Hours, perhaps. Cassius began extinguishing candles. When it happens, stay together. The bonding will help, but the flood will be catastrophic. Don't fight it. Let the emotions flow through both of you." They left the chamber together, climbing stairs toward the castle proper. Dawn was approaching, painting eastern windows in shades of gold. Magnus felt exhaustion pulling at him, but more than that, felt anticipation. Soon the curse would break. Soon 30 years of frozen emotions would thaw, and bound together by choice and magic and something neither had words for yet, they would face it the only way that mattered. Together. Day 15. The breaking. The curse broke 3 hours after dawn on day 15, exactly as Archon Cassius had predicted. Magnus had been reviewing supply reports in his study. Arisel seated across the desk annotating maps with corrections to boundary markers when the first wave hit. Not pain, though the intensity approached agony. More like drowning in sensation after 30 years of breathing vacuum. Every emotion he'd suppressed, every feeling he'd buried beneath tactical necessity, flooding back with the force of a dam collapse. He gasped, reports scattering from nerveless fingers. The room tilted. Strong hands caught his shoulders, Arisel's presence suddenly immediate. Through their bond, Magnus felt the Lunari taking some of the weight, emotions flowing across their connection like water finding its level. "Breathe." Arisel's voice cut through chaos. "Don't fight it. Let it flow through both of us." Magnus tried to comply, but 30 years of grief demanded acknowledgement all at once. His father's execution, soldiers lost in campaigns whose strategic value now seemed hollow, Elena, the 12-year-old girl who'd burned because Magnus had prioritized military objectives over civilian evacuation, faces upon faces, names he'd buried in reports, lives reduced to acceptable losses. The guilt threatened to crush him. But across the bond, Arisel bore half the weight. The Lunari's presence in Magnus's mind felt like anchor in hurricane. Shared burden meant shared survival. The emotional flood that should have destroyed Magnus instead flowed into two vessels. How long the first wave lasted, Magnus couldn't say. Time lost meaning when every moment contained decades of suppressed feeling. But eventually, gradually, the intensity diminished to something approaching manageable. He found himself on the floor, Arisel's arms around him, both breathing hard from exertion that had nothing to do with physical effort. "Is it always going to be like this?" Magnus asked when he could form words. "This intense?" Cassius said the initial breaking would be worst. Arisel's voice carried its own exhaustion. "After this, it should stabilize. You'll feel things normally instead of all at once." Magnus became aware of wetness on his face. Tears. Something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Not tears of pain, though grief contributed. Tears of release. Of 30 years of pressure finally escaping. Through the bond, he felt Arisel's emotions. Concern mixed with relief mixed with something deeper. Affection earned through shared trial. "Thank you." Magnus spoke quietly, still held in Arisel's arms. "For not letting me face this alone. You couldn't have." Arisel's hand moved to Magnus's wrist, thumb tracing the silver mark. "We're bound now. Your storms are my storms." A knock at the door. Blackwood's voice carried urgency. "Your Majesty, the Southern Kingdom has mobilized forces. Scouts report 30,000 troops moving toward our border." Magnus felt his tactical mind engaged despite emotional exhaustion. The Southern Kingdom, opportunistic neighbors who'd been watching. They'd seen Magnus attend peace negotiations, show vulnerability, and interpreted it as weakness to exploit. He rose with Arisel's help, both men steadying each other. Blackwood's expression shifted as he took in their disheveled appearance. The curse broke. Magnus heard himself say words that would have been unthinkable before. Archon Cassius predicted it. The bonding stabilized the transition, but it was catastrophic. "I'm functional now, but barely." Blackwood's gaze shifted to Arisel, recognition dawning. "You went through with the ritual." "We did." Arisel met the general's eyes. Magnus needed an anchor. "I chose to be that anchor." Blackwood nodded slowly. "The Southern Kingdom likely received intelligence about your condition. They're gambling. You're too compromised to mount effective defense. Then they've miscalculated." Magnus forced his voice into command register. "Convene the War Council. I want full assessment of their force composition, projected routes, defensive options. We have how long before they reach the border?" 4 days at their current pace, possibly 5 if weather turns. "Enough time." Magnus moved toward his war room. "And get word to Elder Miriel. Ask if the Lunari alliance she mentioned is still available. Day 16, the strategy. The War Council assembled with efficiency of veteran officers responding to crisis. Maps spread across the familiar oak table, markers indicating enemy positions and defensive arrangements. Magnus studied the situation with clarity that surprised him, given recent events. 30,000 troops suggests full invasion rather than border raid. He traced likely approach routes. They'll expect us to consolidate at the capital, defend from fortified position. Commander Garrett leaned forward, his gratitude for his son's safe return evident in renewed loyalty. We have 12,000 combat ready, another 3,000 in training. Against 30,000, defensive strategy makes sense. It makes predictable sense. Magnus felt his tactical instincts asserting themselves, which means it's exactly what they'll prepare for. Lord Castellan spoke with his characteristic administrative precision, each word carefully measured. The Treasury has funds for extended campaign, but protracted siege would strain resources considerably. Economic factors favor swift resolution. Archon Cassius consulted reports. Intelligence on Southern Kingdom supply lines shows vulnerability. They're moving fast, which means minimal supplies. They'll need to establish depots as they advance. Magnus studied the terrain, calculating with mind that had commanded armies for 3 decades. Those supply depots are their weakness. He indicated positions on the map. Without them, 30,000 soldiers become 30,000 mouths that can't be fed. You're suggesting raids. Blackwood's expression shifted from defensive concern to offensive interest. Strike teams hitting supply lines instead of meeting them in pitched battle. I'm suggesting we use every advantage we have. Magnus gestured to Arisel. The Lunari knows terrain in that region, hidden trails, approach routes the Southern Kingdom won't have mapped. We position strike teams to hit their supplies while maintaining defensive posture at the capital. Lord Harwick cleared his throat with aristocratic hesitation, the conservative noble struggling with changed circumstances. Your Majesty coordinating such operations while managing recent personal developments. Perhaps delegation to field commanders would be prudent? I'll be leading one of the strike teams personally. Magnus made the decision with certainty that allowed no argument. These men will follow orders I'm giving with full knowledge of costs involved. The least I can do is share the risk. Blackwood started to object, then stopped as he recognized something in Magnus's expression. The general had served long enough to know when argument would prove futile. Arisel moved to the map, his knowledge of northern geography extending to southern routes. Here, this canyon provides perfect ambush position for their first supply convoy, and here, this forest offers concealment for a force large enough to destroy their advance depot. The council exchanged glances, their king's Lunari advisor, proposing tactics that might save the kingdom. The political implications could wait until after the military crisis. How many men for the strike teams? Garrett asked. 500 for each target. Magnus made calculations based on experience. Cavalry for mobility, scouts for intelligence, engineers to ensure destroyed supplies can't be salvaged. Hit them fast, withdraw before they can respond, repeat until their logistics collapse. And if they accelerate their advance, Harwick pressed, if they sacrifice supply security for speed, then we meet them in the battle with the advantage of prepared defenses and intact supply lines. Magnus met each council member's gaze, but I'm gambling they won't. No commander commits 30,000 troops to invasion without securing logistics first. A runner arrived, breathless. Your Majesty, Elder Miriel has responded. She offers 2,000 Lunari fighters if you'll accept combined forces. Send word that their assistance is accepted with gratitude. Magnus felt surprise register, then gratitude, the emotional responses coming naturally now. Coordinate with General Blackwood on integration. After the council dispersed, Arisel spoke quietly. You just accepted military alliance with former enemies. Your council will have opinions. My council can have all the opinions they want. Magnus felt something settle into place. I'm done making decisions based on fear of judgment. The curse kept me isolated. I'm choosing differently now. Days 17 and 18, the preparation. The next 2 days passed in controlled chaos of military preparation. Strike teams assembled and trained in tactics designed for speed and destruction. Supply lines were reinforced at the capital. Defensive positions prepared for possibility that raids might fail. Magnus threw himself into preparation with focus that helped manage emotional volatility still plaguing him as the curse's final hold released. But unlike before, when preparation had been refuge from feelings he couldn't access, now it was partnership with emotions that informed rather than paralyzed. Arisel remained constantly present, anchoring Magnus through moments when grief or guilt threatened to overwhelm. The bond made it possible to function despite emotional flood. But more than that, Arisel's tactical knowledge proved invaluable. On the evening of Day 17, Magnus stood on the battlements watching sunset paint his kingdom in amber and gold. Arisel joined him with ease of someone who no longer needed invitation. "Are you ready for this?" Arisel asked. "You're leading one of the strike teams personally against Blackwood's advice. I need to be there." Magnus kept his gaze on the horizon. "These men are following orders I'm giving with full knowledge of costs. The least I can do is share the risk." "That's not tactical necessity." Arisel's observation carried no judgment. "That's moral necessity. The curse wouldn't have understood the distinction." "No, it wouldn't have." Magnus turned to face him. "Before you, I would have sent men to die while remaining safe. I would have justified it as preserving command structure. Now I can't hide behind those justifications. You're becoming the king your kingdom needs." Arisel's hand found Magnus's. "Not the weapon the curse created, the leader people deserve." "I hope you're right." Day 18 brought final preparations. Magnus reviewed tactics with team commanders, ensuring everyone understood objectives and withdrawal protocols. Blackwood oversaw logistics with attention to detail that had kept him alive through decades of campaigns. In the afternoon, Lunari forces arrived with Elder Miriel herself, leading 2,000 warriors who'd chosen alliance over ancient grudge. Magnus met her in the Great Hall. "You've changed since our first meeting." Miriel studied him. "The curse breaking is obvious to anyone trained to see such things." "With help." Magnus glanced to where Arisel stood among Lunari delegation. "Your people's magic made it possible to survive what should have destroyed me. You can repay the debt by proving the curse's end means permanent change." Miriel's voice carried weight of historical awareness. 300 years we've been enemies. If you can transform that legacy, the debt is paid. The combined force presented spectacle that made political statement as powerful as any military advantage. Southern Kingdom scouts would report back to commanders who'd expected divided opposition. Instead, they'd find alliance suggesting the kingdom they'd thought weakened was stronger than ever. Day 19. The Canyon Ambush. The strike team departed 3 hours before dawn on Day 19, 500 cavalry and support personnel moving with practiced silence. Magnus rode at their head, Blackwood beside him, and Arisel close enough that their bond provided constant awareness. The canyon Arisel had identified proved perfect for ambush. Steep walls, single approach, limited sightlines for scouts. Magnus positioned forces with care earned through decades of experience. Cavalry concealed behind terrain features, archers elevated for clear firing lanes, engineers prepared to trigger rock slides that would close escape routes. They waited as sun rose and advanced across stone walls. Time stretched, each moment containing possibilities of success or disaster. Magnus felt his heart rate steady despite tension, emotions present but controlled through combination of experience and shared burden across bond with Arisel. The supply convoy appeared precisely when scouts had predicted. 50 wagons heavy with provisions for 30,000 soldiers. Guard force of perhaps 200, sufficient for normal security but inadequate against prepared ambush. Magnus waited until the convoy reached optimal position, until withdrawal became difficult and support impossible. Then he gave the signal. Cavalry charged from concealment, hitting flanks with speed that prevented organized response. Archers released waves targeting guards rather than drivers, minimizing casualties while maximizing disruption. Engineers triggered prepared charges, bringing rock slides crashing down and sealing both canyon ends. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. Most guards surrendered when organized resistance became impossible. 15 died fighting, inevitable cost that Magnus felt with emotional weight that was new and terrible and necessary. When dust settled and prisoners were secured, Magnus surveyed wagons loaded with supplies that would never reach Southern Kingdom's advancing army. Grain and salted meat and medical provisions. Everything needed to sustain invasion. Burn it all. Magnus gave the order despite waste it represented. Every wagon. Leave nothing they can salvage. Engineers went to work while cavalry maintained perimeter. Magnus watched flames consume resources that could have fed his own people, feeling grief at necessity that previous version of himself would have dismissed. Arisel appeared at his side. You won. Minimal casualties on our side. Enemy logistics disrupted exactly as planned. This is success. Then why does it feel hollow? Magnus gestured at burning wagons. Those supplies represented labor by people who had nothing to do with their king's decision to invade. Because you're seeing full cost instead of just tactical advantage. Arisel's hand found Magnus's arm. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. The strike team returned to capital without incident, mission successful. Reports from other teams arrived over next hours. Second supply depot destroyed. Third convoy intercepted and supplies scattered. And from north, Lunari fighters arrived with news that they'd cut additional Southern Kingdom supply lines. Day 20, the withdrawal. The Southern Kingdom's advance slowed, then stopped. Without supply lines, 30,000 soldiers became massive liability rather than invasion force. Their commanders sent emissaries under flag of parley on day 20, seeking terms that would allow withdrawal without further loss of face or resources. Magnus met them in the Great Hall, conscious of historical parallel to meeting with Lunari delegation. Terms were negotiated with efficiency, born from both sides recognizing reality. Southern Kingdom would withdraw, pay reparations for invasion preparation, commit to 10-year non-aggression treaty. In exchange, they kept their army intact and avoided humiliation of total defeat. When emissaries departed, Blackwood approached. Your Majesty, the threat is neutralized. The campaign is won without major battle. Casualties minimal. This is, by any measure, a significant victory. Magnus nodded, feeling satisfaction that now registered with emotional depth it never had before. And young Thomas Garrett is safely returned. Commander Garrett can sleep knowing his son survived. The general's weathered face showed surprise at the personal acknowledgement. Yes, Your Majesty. The men are saying you've changed, that you see them as people now, not just tactical assets. Because I do. Magnus spoke simply. The curse made it impossible to see humans as anything beyond pieces on a board. That's ended now. Days 21 through 25, the resolution. The council convened on day 21 to address matters that had been building since the auction 15 days prior. Magnus stood before them with Arisel at his side, in position that spoke of partnership rather than servitude. The curse is broken. Magnus began with simple truth. 300 years of emotional suppression have ended. I'm capable now of feeling everything it denied: fear, joy, grief, love, all of it present and accounted for. He paused, meeting each council member's gaze. This changes how I lead, not the tactical skill, that remains. But I can no longer make decisions without feeling their full weight. I can no longer see people as resources rather than humans whose lives have inherent value. Lord Harwick spoke with aristocratic caution. Your Majesty, the bonding with the Lunari has been noted by the entire court. The political implications are considerable. Questions about succession, legal status, the kingdom's future. Then we'll answer those questions. Magnus felt Arisel's presence beside him. Arisel Corvain is no longer slave or consultant. He's my bonded partner, legally and magically bound until death. I'm proposing the council recognize a new status. Oath brother to the king. Position acknowledging both his Lunari heritage and his essential role in this kingdom's future. Silence followed, tradition confronting necessity. Archon Cassius spoke from his corner. The bonding ritual requires mutual consent, creates permanent connection that death alone can sever. In magical terms, Arisel is already Magnus's equal, regardless of legal framework. The question is whether we acknowledge reality or pretend otherwise. Blackwood added support with soldiers' directness. The Lunari saved your king's life, helped break the curse that has plagued this bloodline for 3 centuries, provided intelligence and tactical knowledge that prevented invasion. If that doesn't earn recognition as ally and partner, what does? Lord Castellan offered his administrative assessment. The precedent is unusual, but legal frameworks can accommodate unique circumstances. Creation of new title within existing power structure presents manageable implementation challenges. One by one, council members voiced acceptance. Some enthusiastic, recognizing opportunity, others reluctant, yielding to pragmatic necessity. But the result was unanimous. Arisel Corvain would be recognized as oath brother to the king, status carrying authority second only to Magnus himself. After council dispersed, after political details had been negotiated and legal frameworks established, Magnus and Arisel found themselves alone in the study where curse had broken 5 days prior. "How does it feel?" Arisel asked quietly. "To have broken free completely, to be human again after 30 years. Magnus considered seriously, examining emotional landscape that would have been impossible to access weeks ago. Terrifying, liberating, overwhelming and necessary. "I'm still learning what it means to feel everything instead of nothing." He moved to where Arisel stood by the window. "But I know this. Whatever I'm becoming, whoever emerges from the curse's shadow, that person is better because you're part of it." The bond didn't just stabilize the transition. It gave me anchor to something beyond tactical necessity. "You're giving me too much credit." Arisel's slight smile held warmth. "You were always capable of this." The curse suppressed it. I just helped create space for it to emerge. Magnus pulled him close. "No, you chose to bind yourself to someone you should have hated. You risked everything on possibility that I could change. That's not just creating space, that's active transformation." The kiss that followed carried weight of acknowledgement and promise. What had begun in moonlight on battlements had deepened through shared trial and mutual choice. When they separated, Arisel spoke with quiet certainty. "What happens now?" "Forward." Magnus spoke with conviction. "Not back to what we were. Forward into something new, a kingdom that values human life over strategic advantage. Alliances built on respect rather than domination. Leadership that acknowledges feeling as strength. That's ambitious." Arisel's tone held affection and realistic assessment. "Change that fundamental takes time. Then we'll face that resistance together." Magnus gestured to encompass castle and kingdom. 300 years, Thorne kings ruled without peace or joy. They conquered and controlled and died hollow. I refuse to continue that legacy. They stood together as evening deepened, two men whose choice had broken curse and forged bond that would define kingdom's future. Day 26 and beyond, the new kingdom. Over the following weeks, change rippled outward from castle through kingdom and beyond. The Lunari Alliance held, transforming ancient enemies into partners in governance and defense. Trade agreements were renegotiated with emphasis on mutual benefit. Military doctrine evolved to emphasize protection over conquest. Magnus led with full awareness of human cost, decisions informed by compassion as well as tactics. There were challenges, conservative factions that resisted change, neighboring kingdoms that tested whether emotional king was weak king, internal doubts about sustainability. But through it all, Magnus and Arisel faced challenges together. Bond forged in ritual and tested in battle provided foundation for partnership that transcended personal relationship to reshape kingdom's identity. 6 months after the curse broke, Magnus stood again on battlements where he and Arisel had first acknowledged love. But now he stood not as cursed king surveying domain he couldn't feel connection to, but as leader who understood weight of responsibility because he felt joy in serving. Arisel joined him with ease born from months of partnership. "You're thinking about how much has changed. Am I that transparent?" "To me you are." Arisel's hand found his. "The bond means I feel your contemplation." Magnus squeezed gently. "I was thinking about my father, about how he died because he chose mercy over tactics, how I spent 40 years believing mercy was weakness. And now? Now I understand that mercy isn't weakness. It's courage to value humanity over strategic advantage." Magnus stared at kingdom spread below. "My father wasn't killed by mercy. He was killed by people who feared what mercy represented, the possibility that cycles of violence could be broken." He paused. "I can't undo the years I spent as weapon, can't bring back those who died because I calculated their lives as acceptable losses. But I can choose differently going forward. Honor my father's memory by proving mercy and strength aren't opposites. That's all any of us can do." Arisel leaned against him. "Learn from past, choose differently in future, trust that accumulated small choices create meaningful change." They stood in comfortable silence as sun set over kingdom slowly transforming from military machine into something more humane. Below, citizens went about lives gradually improving as resources shifted from conquest to development. Throughout the realm, evidence accumulated that curse's end meant real and lasting change. "Do you ever regret it?" Magnus asked. "Binding yourself to me, giving up autonomy." "Never." Arisel's response came without hesitation. You gave me purpose beyond survival, connection beyond solitude, love. I'd stopped believing was possible. Even knowing you'll die when I die? Especially knowing that. Arisel turned to face him. I don't want life without you. The bond didn't create that truth. It just made it permanent. Magnus felt emotion well up, tears coming readily now. You make me better than I would be alone, not just as king, as person, as man learning what it means to be human after 30 years of being weapon. You make me better too. Arisel's hand rose to Magnus's face. You gave me hope that change was possible, that bloodlines didn't determine destiny, that curse could be broken and love could triumph over history. The kiss they shared tasted of sunset and promise and years of partnership stretching ahead. Night fell over the kingdom of Iron Reach, painting walls and towers in shadow and starlight. In the castle, Magnus and Arisel stood together as they had countless times and would countless times again. The path ahead held challenges they couldn't anticipate and trials they'd face together. But unlike kings before him who'd ruled with power but without peace, Magnus Thorne had discovered truth the curse tried desperately to hide. Strength without connection was just elaborate isolation. Power without compassion was only another prison. Victory without joy was indistinguishable from defeat. But love freely chosen and courageously maintained could transform curse into blessing, could turn enemy into partner, could reshape kingdom built on violence into realm that valued human dignity. 300 years the curse had lasted, creating dynasty of powerful but hollow kings. It had ended not through military might, but through vulnerability and choice and willingness to believe that connection was worth any cost. Magnus had bought Arisel for 500 gold at auction, thinking he was acquiring intelligence asset. Instead, he'd found partner, anchor, love that had broken curse and remade him into leader his kingdom deserved. And in castle built on centuries of violence, two men stood watching stars emerge in darkening sky, bound by magic and choice and love that would define generations yet unborn. The curse was broken. The kingdom was transforming. And Magnus Thorne, once weapon and crown, but now man who'd learned to feel, had finally found the peace that 300 years of his ancestors had sought and failed to achieve. Not peace through domination, not peace imposed through force, but peace earned through vulnerability and maintained through love. In the end, that was the curse's true lesson. Power could conquer kingdoms, but only love could heal souls. Strength could win battles, but only connection could break cycles of violence. Magnus pulled Arisel close as first stars appeared, grateful beyond words for chance encounter at auction block that had transformed curse into salvation. The road ahead held uncertainty and challenge and years of work to fully transform kingdom's identity. But they would walk that road together, bound by choice and strengthened by love. Two men from enemy bloodlines who'd discovered that the greatest victory wasn't conquest of others, but transformation of self. And in Kingdom of Iron Reach, under stars that had witnessed 3 centuries of curse, change continued its steady work. Small at first, barely noticeable, but growing with each passing day, each choice to value humanity over tactics, each moment of connection freely chosen and courageously maintained. The Wolf King had found his heart, and in finding it, had shown his kingdom the path from violence to peace, from curse to blessing, from isolation to love. The future remained unwritten. But whatever came next, Magnus and Arisel would face it the only way that mattered. Together, human, free.